Smoke first, then the sound. A cabin roof folding in on itself like a lung giving out its last breath. Sparks climbing into a black sky, so many of them it looked like the stars themselves had caught fire and were falling back down to punish the earth for something. A man ran through it, low, fast, one arm wrapped across his face, the other dragging a child by the collar of her nightdress. Somewhere behind him, a beam cracked. Somewhere behind him, a horse screamed. He did not stop. He would tell people later that he did not remember the burn. Not really. Not the way you remember pain when you have time to feel it arrive. He remembered heat, a wall of it, pressing against the side of his face like a hand that meant to hold him there. He remembered the child's weight going slack, and the terror that came with that slackness, worse than any fire. He remembered the door, a door that should not have been shut, should not have been latched, not from a fire that started inside a home where a family slept, trusting the night to be ordinary. The door had been latched from the outside. Nobody talked about that afterward, not for a long time. There were more urgent things to grieve. A wife, a name burned half off a man's face and half out of a town's memory. A child who lived only because a man threw himself between her and a falling rafter and took the mark of it across his jaw, his neck, the whole left side of him, a scar shaped like something reaching. He carried that reaching thing for 11 years before anyone in the town of Larkspur Hollow asked him a single honest question about it. Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 11 years later. The morning it all started, frost lay thin and silver across the pasture fence, and Elias' Vane split kindling before the sun had fully committed to rising. He worked the way he did most things, economically, without wasted motion, the axe falling in the same short arc again and again until the wood surrendered in clean, obedient halves. A man watching him would have thought he looked at peace. A man watching him closely would have noticed that his eyes never settled anywhere for long, the way a man's eyes do when he has spent a decade being looked at instead of seen. That was the thing nobody understood about a scarred man in a small town. It was not the pain of the mark itself, faded now to something more like old leather than open wound. It was the tax of it. The way every stranger's gaze snagged and stumbled, and then, ashamed, looked away too fast. The way children stared frankly until their mothers hissed at them to stop, as if looking were the crime, and not the century of practice grown men had at pretending not to. Elias Vane trapped for a living. Beaver in the high country when the season allowed it, and in the lean months he ran a modest freight line hauling goods between Larkspur Hollow and the rail spur 2 days east. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulder in the way of a man who had done hard outdoor work since boyhood, and he lived alone in a cabin he had built with his own hands after the first one burned, on a rise above the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to give him privacy from the road. He liked the privacy. He told himself he liked the privacy. Inside the cabin that morning, a coffee pot sat blackened on the stove, and a single chipped cup waited beside it, because there was never a reason to set out too. He had eaten breakfast alone for 11 years, and if there was an ache in that, he had gotten so practiced at not naming it that most days he did not feel it as ache at all, just as weather, just as the shape of things. He finished the kindling, stacked it by the door, and went in to eat before the frost burned off. It was Hollis Prine who nudged him toward the thing that would change all of it, though Hollis would later insist, with the particular pride of a man who likes being right, that he had known exactly what he was doing. Hollis ran the mercantile in town, a narrow building with a bell over the door that announced customers before they had fully crossed the threshold. And he was, by reputation, the friendliest gossip in 3 counties, a man who could turn a purchase of nails into a 20-minute accounting of who had married whom and who ought to. He had known Elias since before the fire, had known Elias's late wife, had watched the boy, because that was how Hollis still thought of him sometimes, the boy, go from an easy laugh to a shuttered door over the course of one terrible night. And he had spent 11 years trying, in his clumsy, affectionate way, to pry that door back open. "You ever think on writing to one of these matrimonial papers?" Hollis said that afternoon, sliding a folded newspaper across the counter the way another man might slide a winning hand of cards. "The kind that run advertisements? Fellow up in Cheyenne swears by it. Says his wife came from Ohio on the strength of 4 paragraphs and a photograph that flattered nobody." Elias did not pick up the paper. "I've got no need of a wife, Hollis." "Everybody's got need of a wife. Some of us just aren't smart enough to admit it." "I've got a cabin that keeps the rain off and a business that keeps me fed. That's need enough met." Hollis studied him with the patient exasperation of a man who has had this exact conversation more times than he can count, and has decided this time to be stubborn about it. "You've got a cabin and a business and a face you keep turned away from every mirror in the county. And don't tell me different because I've watched you shave in the reflection of a tin plate rather than look yourself full in a glass. That's not a life, Elias. That's a sentence you're serving." The words landed harder than Hollis probably intended, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the bell over the door swinging faintly, though no one had come or gone. "I'll think on it," Elias said finally, which both of them understood to mean he would not. He took the newspaper anyway, because refusing outright felt like more trouble than folding it into his coat pocket and forgetting about it. And that should have been the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. That night, by lamplight, with the wind picking at the corners of the cabin the way it always did before a hard frost, Elias unfolded the newspaper out of nothing more than boredom, or so he told himself, and turned to the page Hollis had dog-eared with a thumbnail crease. A column of advertisements ran down the page in small, cramped type. Widows seeking situations. Farmers seeking sturdy wives accustomed to labor. A school teacher in Nebraska who wished to correspond with a man of good character and settled habits. And near the bottom, one that stopped him, though he could not at first say why. Woman, 29 years, unmarried, seeks correspondence with a man who will not be frightened by size or strength. 6 feet 4 inches in height, capable of a full day's labor, honest, plain-spoken, tired of being looked at and never seen. Photographs available upon request, though the advertiser warns they rarely prepare a man for the reality. He read it 3 times. There was something almost defiant in the wording. A woman who had clearly written her own advertisement rather than let some go-between soften it for her. A woman who had decided that if she was going to be rejected, she would rather be rejected honestly and get it over with than be courted under false pretenses and disappointed later. Tired of being looked at and never seen.
He read that line a 4th time. He told himself he was not the sort of man who answered advertisements in newspapers, that this was Hollis's foolishness and not his own. That a woman 6 feet 4 inches tall who described herself in terms of labor and honesty rather than charm was probably, like him, simply used to being unwanted and had learned to advertise that fact before anyone else could use it against her. He told himself all of that. Then he found a pencil and a scrap of paper and began, badly, a first draft of a letter he was not at all sure he intended to send. Her name was Josephine Calloway, though for most of her life people had simply called her by her height before they bothered learning her name at all. And on the morning that Elias Vane sat hunched over his kitchen table, composing and discarding sentences, she stood in a lawyer's office 300 miles east in Nebraska, being told, in the smoothest voice she had ever heard, that she no longer owned the land her father had died, leaving her. The lawyer's name was Cornelius Thane. He wore a gray suit that fit him the way water fits a glass, without a single wrinkle of resistance, and he had a way of steepling his fingers when he delivered bad news that made the bad news sound almost like a kindness he was doing her. You understand, Miss Calloway, that the deed itself was never in question. The question was always the debt attached to it. Your father, God rest him, borrowed against the acreage in his final year, and I am afraid the terms were quite explicit on the matter of default. My father did not borrow money, Josephine said. Her voice was level. It had to be level, because she had learned a long time ago that a large woman who raised her voice was a large woman people called dangerous, while a large woman who kept her voice level was, at best, tolerated. My father did not owe anyone $1 when he died. I kept his books myself. I have the note here, if you'd care to examine the signature. He slid a paper across the desk, and she looked at a signature that resembled her father's handwriting the way a reflection in disturbed water resembles a face. Close enough to unsettle, wrong enough that something in her chest went cold with certainty, even before her mind caught up to name what she was certain of. This is not his hand. I understand this is difficult to accept. I said this is not his hand, Mr. Thane. She did not raise her voice. She set both palms flat on the desk instead, and even seated, even folded down into a chair too small for her, the way every chair in every office had always been too small for her. She was a considerable presence, and she watched something flicker behind the lawyer's eyes that might, in a smaller and less careful man, have been fear. He recovered his smoothness quickly. He always did. I would encourage you not to make accusations you cannot prove, Miss Calloway. The bank holds the note. The bank will exercise its rights within 30 days unless the debt is satisfied. I am sorry, truly. I know this land meant a great deal to you. She left his office with her hands shaking, though by the time she reached the street, she had willed them still, because a woman her size, shaking in public, read to onlookers as something to be afraid of, rather than something to comfort. And she had spent 29 years learning exactly how the world chose to read her. 30 days. She had 30 days to find $400 she did not have, to save land that had been in her family for 2 decades, to prove a forgery that a smooth man in a gray suit had already told her, with perfect courtesy, that she could not prove. She did not know yet that Cornelius Thane's real business was not lending money at all, not primarily. She did not know that he had done this before, in other counties, under other names, to other families who had something worth taking, and no one powerful enough to stop him from taking it. She did not know that the fire that had scarred a trapper's face 11 years and 300 miles away carried, somewhere in its cold ashes, the same man's fingerprints. She only knew that she was about to lose the one thing that had ever felt like hers, and that she was, once again, entirely alone in facing it. That night, in the small rented room above the dressmaker's shop where she had been staying since the funeral, she took out paper of her own, and a newspaper folded to a page of advertisements she had circled weeks earlier, in a moment of loneliness she was almost too proud to admit to, and she found, near the bottom of a column she had read a dozen times, a name that had not been there before. A reply. Elias Vane. Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Her hands were not shaking now. They were something closer to hopeful, which frightened her more. She read his letter twice before she let herself feel anything about it, the way you test a floorboard before you trust it with your full weight. I will not pretend I know what to say to a stranger, he had written, in a hand that was plain and unhurried. So I will say only what is true. I was burned in a fire 11 years ago, saving a neighbor's child, and the left side of my face carries the mark of it still, and will always. People in this town have grown used to me, mostly, though I do not think used to is the same as comfortable with, and I have stopped expecting it to become the same. I run a freight line and trap in season, and I am, by most accounts, a solitary man, though I am beginning to wonder whether solitary was ever a choice I made, so much as a habit I fell into and never questioned. Your advertisement said you are tired of being looked at and never seen. I understand that better than most men would. I do not know what I have to offer a woman who has learned to expect disappointment, but if you are willing to correspond, I am willing to be honest, which is the only thing I know for certain I can promise. She read it a third time. She wrote back that same night, by candlelight, with the deadline of 30 days sitting cold and unspoken in the corner of the room. And she told herself the letter was only about the advertisement, only about a lonely woman answering a lonely man, and had nothing at all to do with the facts that she needed, more than she had needed anything in a long time, to feel like something other than a problem waiting to be solved by strangers in gray suits. She did not mention the debt, not in that first letter. She would come to regret the silence later, though not for the reasons she expected. For now, she simply wrote, I appreciate honesty above nearly every other quality a person can offer. I am 6 feet 4 inches tall, and I have spent my whole life being the first thing anyone notices and the last thing anyone truly looks at. I have run a homestead nearly alone since my father's health began to fail 2 years ago, and I can put up a fence, break a horse, and do the work of 2 men without complaint, though I have often been made to feel that this makes me less of a woman rather than more capable of being one. I do not know what a solitary man from Wyoming wants with a correspondence from a woman he has never met, but I would like to find out. The letters came every 2 weeks, then every 10 days, then, by the time 6 weeks had passed, as often as the post could carry them, and something in both of them that had gone quiet a long time ago began, cautiously, to make noise again. It was not romance, not at first. It was recognition. 2 people who had each spent years apologizing with their posture for the space they took up in a room, finding in each other's handwriting the first person who did not seem to need that apology at all. Elias wrote about the trap lines, the particular gray quality of light in the high country before snow, the way a good dog could read a man's mood before the man himself understood it. Josephine wrote about her father, about the smell of new-cut hay, about a horse she had broken herself at 17 when the ranch hands had all said the animal was too much horse for a girl her size to manage, not understanding, or not caring, that her size was exactly why she had managed it. She wrote, once, about the first joke either of them had risked with the other. He had mentioned offhand that most door frames in Larkspur Hollow had not been built with him in mind, and she had written back that this made 2 of them, that she had cracked her head on more lintels than she could count, and had begun at some point in her 20s simply to duck through every doorway on principle, guilty ones and innocent ones alike. He laughed out loud reading that letter, alone in his cabin, and the sound startled him, because it had been a long time since he had laughed at something that was not aimed to wound. By the 3rd month, the letters had stopped being about trap lines and hay at all, though those subjects still appeared, like furniture in a room where something else entirely was happening. I think, Elias wrote in early spring, that I would like to meet you. Not because the letters have not been enough, they have been more than enough, but because I find I want to know if the woman who wrote them is real in the way I have started to believe she is,
or whether I have simply been lonely enough to invent her. Josephine held that letter for a long time before she answered it, because the deadline she had never mentioned to him had come and gone weeks earlier, and had not resolved the way deadlines resolve when a debt is paid. It had resolved the way deadlines resolve when a woman runs out of options and watches helpless as men in suits arrive with papers and men with wagons arrive to carry away what furniture the bank did not already claim as collateral. She had lost the land in the second week of March. She had not told him. She told herself she had not told him because it did not matter, because whatever was growing between them in the letters was not built on land or money, and did not need to know about either. She told herself this while packing the last of her father's books into a single trunk, while standing in a kitchen that would belong to strangers by summer, while writing to a man in Wyoming, as though her whole life had not just come apart at the seams in a lawyer's smooth, courteous voice. She did not tell herself the truth, which was simpler and harder. She was ashamed, not of the debt, of what it might mean to him. A woman without land, without a home of her own, arriving on a man's doorstep with nothing but a trunk and a reputation for being too large, too capable, too much. It felt some nights like confirming every fear he might secretly still harbor, despite every kind word he had written her. She wrote back instead, "I would like to meet you too." She did not say where she would be coming from, or why, or that she no longer had anywhere else to go. She only said when, and let the rest wait for a conversation she was not yet brave enough to have on paper. She did not know, when she sealed that letter, that Cornelius Thane's business in Nebraska had concluded to his satisfaction, and that he had already turned his attention west to Wyoming territory, where a colleague of his, a man who called himself an agent for the Territorial Bank but answered in truth to Thane and to no one else, had begun quietly inquiring after land along the creek near a town called Larkspur Hollow, land that included, among its neighboring parcels, the modest freight business and cabin belonging to a trapper named Elias Vane. The two of them, 300 miles apart, each carrying a wound they had not yet shown the other, were about to collide with the same shadow from two different directions, and neither of them had the first idea it was coming. The stagecoach arrived in Larkspur Hollow on a Tuesday in late April, dust rising behind it in a long gold ribbon that caught the afternoon light, and by the time it rolled to a stop outside the Mercantile, half the town had found some reason to be standing on the boardwalk. Word travels fast in a town of 400 people, and word had traveled faster than usual regarding the particular nature of the woman Elias Vane was expecting. Hollis Prine, who considered himself at least partially responsible for the whole arrangement, and was not shy about saying so, had let slip the contents of one too many conversations, and by Tuesday morning the general understanding around town was that the trapper's intended bride stood taller than most men, and opinions on what that might mean ranged from curious to unkind. A crowd gathers differently when it expects a spectacle than when it expects an arrival, and this crowd, God help them, had come for a spectacle. The coach door opened. A boot came down first, sturdy and plain, and then a second. And then Josephine Calloway unfolded herself from the coach the way a person unfolds from a space built for someone considerably smaller, and stood at last fully upright on the packed dirt of Larkspur Hollow's main street. Someone in the crowd actually gasped. A child's voice, high and unfiltered by any sense of manners, said, "She's a giant!" Loud enough to carry, and his mother hissed his name in mortification, though her own eyes had not stopped their own frank appraisal. Josephine had heard worse. She had heard worse her whole life, delivered with less courtesy and more cruelty than one startled boy on a dusty street. And so she did what she had trained herself to do in exactly this kind of moment. She stood straighter, not smaller, lifted her chin, not lowered it, and let her gaze move across the gathered crowd with a calm that dared any one of them to say something to her face instead of behind a raised hand. Nobody did. Nobody, that is, except the one person the crowd had gathered to watch her meet. Elias Vane stood at the edge of the boardwalk, hat in his hands, the scarred side of his face turned, out of 11 years of habit, slightly away from the crowd and toward her, which was itself a kind of unconscious honesty, because for the first time in a very long while, he was not thinking about how his face would be received. He was thinking about her. She was, in every particular the advertisement had promised, considerable. Broad-shouldered, strong-armed, standing a full head above him and most other men present, her traveling dress plain and practical, her dark hair pulled back beneath a bonnet she wore like a woman who had never quite learned to make peace with bonnets. And her face, when she finally found him in the crowd, and their eyes met across the width of the street, did something that undid him more thoroughly than her height ever could. It did not flinch.
It did not so much as flicker toward the scarred side of his face and skitter away, the way every stranger's gaze had done for 11 years. She looked at him the way she might look at any man she was meeting for the first time, with open, unguarded curiosity, and something that, if he had let himself name it right there in the street, he would have called relief. He crossed the street toward her, and the crowd, sensing that the spectacle they had come for was not going to arrive in the shape they expected, began the awkward business of pretending they had never gathered to watch at all. "Miss Calloway," he said, and found his voice steadier than he had any right to expect. "Mr. Vane?" She extended a hand, not delicate, not offered for him to bow over, but offered the way one offers a hand to shake. And he took it, and her grip was firm and sure and entirely without apology. "You're taller than I pictured," he said, and then, hearing himself, added, "Though I suppose that's a foolish thing to lead with." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You're more handsome than your letters led me to expect, though I suspect that's an equally foolish thing to say back." Somewhere in the crowd, someone snorted a laugh they tried and failed to disguise as a cough, and Josephine glanced toward the sound without malice, only a kind of weary familiarity, the look of a woman who has long since stopped expecting a room to behave itself around her. Elias saw that look. He recognized it because he wore a version of it himself every day of his life, and something in him, some old, careful, guarded thing, decided in that moment, without his full permission, that he was going to spend the rest of however long she would let him standing exactly where he could see that look and answer it. "I've got a wagon," he said. "It's not much of a welcome, I know. I'd have brought something finer if I'd thought of it." "I didn't come 300 miles for a fine welcome, Mr. Vane." Her voice dropped just slightly, just enough that it was meant for him and not the street. "I came because your letters were the first honest thing anyone said to me in longer than I care to admit." He did not know yet what she meant by that, did not know about the lawyer in the gray suit, or the forged signature, or the 30 days that had come and gone and left her with nothing but a trunk and a letter she'd been too ashamed to write honestly. He only knew that something in her voice carried a weight she had not set down, and that he recognized the shape of carried weight because he had been hauling his own for 11 years. "Well then," he said, and reached for her trunk before she could reach for it herself, which earned him a look, not offended, just assessing. The look of a woman checking whether the gesture came from courtesy
or from some assumption about what she could or could not lift herself. He met the look steadily. "I know you can carry it. I'd like to, anyway." Something in her shoulders eased fractionally. The smallest unconscious mirroring of two people learning each other's rhythms already, in the first 5 minutes, without either of them quite noticing they'd begun. "There's a room made up for you at the boarding house," he said, as he loaded the trunk into the wagon bed. "Until the preacher can see us properly wed, if that's still your wish. I didn't want to presume." "It's still my wish," she said. And the words came out steadier than she felt, because she had not told him yet about Nebraska, about the debt, about the fact that she was not simply a woman seeking correspondence, but a woman who had run out of every other door and found, in his letters, the only one still open to her. She told herself she would explain it properly once they knew each other better.
She told herself there would be time. She did not yet know how little time either of them actually had. The wedding took place 11 days later, in the small, clapboard church at the edge of town, with a congregation considerably smaller than the crowd that had gathered to watch her step off the stagecoach, because curiosity, it turned out, was a poor substitute for goodwill, and not everyone in Larkspur Hollow had decided yet whether they approved of a scarred trapper marrying a woman the town had already, unkindly, taken to calling the giantess behind cupped hands. Hollis Prine attended, of course, beaming through the whole ceremony like a man who had personally invented the institution of marriage. His wife, Dorothea, cried without embarrassment. A handful of neighbors came out of genuine goodwill, among them a widow named Ruth Anders, who lived on the adjoining parcel and had, in the weeks since Josephine's arrival, taken to leaving small gifts on the cabin's porch rail. A jar of preserves, a length of good wool, once, memorably, a hand-carved wooden spoon too large for any ordinary kitchen, sized deliberately and without comment for Josephine's hands. It was, Josephine thought, standing at the front of that small church in a dress she had altered herself because no dressmaker in 3 counties had fabric enough on hand for a woman her size. The first time in longer than she could remember that a gift had been given to her not despite her size, but because of it. Made to fit her, made to say, "You belong exactly as you are." She had to blink hard against sudden tears, and Elias beside her saw it and did not ask what had caused it, only reached over and took her hand, which was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of question and its own kind of answer, both. The preacher's words were plain and brief, as was customary in a territory where ceremony was a luxury few could afford to draw out, and when he pronounced them married, Elias turned to her, turned the scarred side of his face fully toward her and the small, gathered congregation, for perhaps the first time in 11 years, without flinching from it himself, and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss. It was careful and a little uncertain, 2 people who barely knew each other's bodies, yet learning the shape of this new thing between them. But it was honest, and when he pulled back, she was smiling. Not the careful, defensive, almost smile she had offered the crowd on the day she arrived, but something wider, something that reached all the way to eyes that had, for a long time, forgotten how to do that without effort. "Well," she said, low enough only he could hear, "I suppose that's the first honest kiss anyone's ever given me, too." He laughed, really laughed, the sound rough with disuse, and the sound carried through the small church and made even the more skeptical of the gathered neighbors exchange a look that suggested they might, in time, come around. Not everyone came around quickly. That would have been too tidy, too easy, and the world Josephine and Elias lived in did not deal often in easy.
There was a woman at the mercantile the following week who audibly remarked, well within earshot, that she did not know what kind of man needed a wife built like a plow horse. And Josephine, standing 3 feet away with a sack of flour balanced easily on one shoulder, turned and looked at the woman with a calm so total it was more unsettling than any anger could have been. "I can lift twice what your husband can, ma'am, and I've never once needed rescuing from a fence line or a runaway wagon. I expect that's worth something, even if it isn't the something you're used to admiring in a woman." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply set the flour down, paid Hollis for it with exact coin, and walked out. And the woman behind her stood, red-faced and silent, because there was no ready answer to a truth spoken that plainly. Hollis, watching from behind the counter, grinned so wide it nearly split his face, and told the story to no fewer than 11 customers before the week was out, each time adding a small flourish of admiration that had not, strictly, been present in the original telling. Slowly, the way frost gives way to thaw, not all at once, but in patches, in edges, in places the sun reaches first, Larkspur Hollow began to make its peace with Josephine Calloway Vane. Children who had gasped at her on the street the day she arrived began instead to gather around her at the fence line when she worked, fascinated by a woman who could lift a fence post one-handed and set it plumb without a level. Fascinated more by the fact that she would let them try, would crouch down, awkwardly, given her height, but without complaint, to show a skinny 8-year-old boy how to grip an axe handle properly. There was one child in particular, a girl of perhaps 6, named Cora, daughter of the widow Ruth Anders, who showed no fear of Josephine from the very first day, walking straight up to her at a town social and asking, with the blunt curiosity only children are permitted, "Are you the tallest lady in the whole world?" "I don't rightly know," Josephine had answered, crouching down to Cora's level with the particular care of someone accustomed to being careful with her own strength. "I've never met every lady in the world to check." "I think you probably are," Cora said, with total confidence, and then, after a moment's consideration, added, "I like it. You can reach things." Josephine had laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And from that day on, Cora attached herself with the singular devotion of a child who has decided, without needing a reason beyond her own instinct, that someone is safe. She would run to Josephine at every gathering, ride on her shoulders when Ruth allowed it, declare loudly and often that Josephine was the strongest person in Larkspur Hollow, and probably the strongest person in Wyoming Territory, and possibly, though this claim required further research, the strongest person in the entire world. It was, Elias thought, watching this unfold from a respectful distance one warm evening in May, a particular kind of grace that children carried and adults slowly unlearned. The grace of seeing a person clearly before the world taught them the shortcuts of fear and assumption. He watched his wife laugh with a 6-year-old on her shoulders, dust catching gold in the last of the daylight, and felt something in his chest that he had not let himself feel in 11 years. The simple, unguarded wish for this, exactly this, to continue. Domestic life settled into its own rhythms in the weeks that followed, the small, unremarkable rituals that turn a shared roof into an actual home. Josephine took to rising before dawn, a habit worn into her from years running her father's homestead, and Elias found himself waking to the sound of her already at work outside, chopping wood with an economy of motion that put his own to shame. Mending the sagging corner of the porch rail he'd meant to fix for 2 years and never gotten around to. Working the vegetable patch with the confident, unhurried competence of someone who had never once been told her hands were built for anything smaller than the work in front of them. He learned the small things about her the way you learn a country by walking it slowly.
that she took her coffee black and too strong, the same way he did, and neither of them commented on it the first few times, though both of them noticed that she hummed, tunelessly and without any apparent awareness she was doing it, while she worked with her hands, that she flinched, just slightly, just once, the first time he reached toward her face to brush away a stray strand of hair, and he understood, without needing it explained, that a lifetime of people commenting on her size had made her wary of hands moving toward her too quickly, even gentle ones, even his. He stopped reaching quickly after that. He learned to move slow, to let her see his hand coming, to give her the choice every time instead of assuming it. And she learned, in turn, the places on his scarred cheek that still carried sensation, and the places that had gone forever numb. Learned to trace the line of it without pity in her touch, only a kind of careful reverence, as though the mark were not a wound to be minimized, but a fact of him worth knowing thoroughly, the way you'd learn the grain of good wood. "Does it hurt still?" she asked him once, in the dark, her fingers resting light along his jaw. "When the weather turns?" "Some," he admitted. "Aches worse before a storm than most any other time. My grandmother used to say a scar remembers weather better than any bone does." "Mine doesn't ache," she said. "But I understand what you mean anyway. There's a kind of ache that isn't in the body." He turned his head against her palm, just slightly, and did not answer. Because there was nothing to say to that except to agree, and some agreements are better felt than spoken. It was 3 weeks into their marriage, on an ordinary Thursday that gave no warning of what it carried, that the first letter arrived. It came by the regular post, addressed to Elias Vane in a hand too formal and precise to belong to anyone in Larkspur Hollow. And when he opened it at the kitchen table that evening, Josephine watched his face, the good side and the scarred side both, go very still. "What is it?" she asked, though something in her chest had already gone cold. Some instinct honed by a similar letter, delivered a similar way, months earlier and 300 miles distant. "A notice," he said slowly, reading it a second time as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. "From a territorial bank. It says there's a lien against this property, a debt against the land, going back to a loan my father took before he died." He looked up at her. "My father's been dead 9 years. He never told me about any loan." Josephine's hand, which had been reaching for the coffee pot, went still on the handle. "What was the bank's name?" she asked, and her voice had a careful flatness to it that he had not heard from her before. Not once in 3 months of letters and 11 days of courtship and 3 weeks of marriage. He checked the letter. Vane and Associates, out of Cheyenne, though the letterhead says they've got offices further east, too. Josephine sat down very slowly in the chair across from him and told him, at last, the thing she had been too ashamed to tell him in any of the letters that came before, the thing that had sat in her chest like a stone through every gentle moment of their courtship and every careful tenderness of the weeks since. "My father's land in Nebraska," she said, "was taken from me in March. A lawyer named Cornelius Vane presented a note, supposedly signed by my father, for a debt my father never took. I told him it was forgery. He told me I couldn't prove it. I lost the land and the house and everything in it that the bank didn't let me keep, inside of 30 days. I should have told you before we married. I was ashamed."
"I didn't want you to think you'd married a woman who came to you with nothing but debt and a ruined name."
Elias sat with that for a long moment, and Josephine watched his jaw work, watched the old, careful stillness come over him that she had learned in 3 weeks meant he was working hard to master some feeling before he let it show. "You should have told me," he said finally, and she flinched, bracing for anger she had earned. Not because it would have changed my mind about marrying you. Because you carried it alone for months when you didn't have to. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be done carrying things alone. That's not what this is supposed to be. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was firm. And something in her chest that had been braced and cold since the day in the lawyer's office finally, slowly, began to loosen. Vane, he said again, testing the name like a man testing ice. The same name. That's no coincidence, is it? I don't believe in coincidences that convenient, Josephine said. Not anymore. They did not sleep well that night, both of them turning the same suspicion over in their minds without yet having words adequate to it, that whatever was happening to Elias's land in Wyoming was not a separate misfortune from what had happened to Josephine's land in Nebraska, but the same hand, reaching across 300 miles to close around them both. Neither of them yet understood how far back that hand reached, or that it had touched Elias's life once before, 11 years earlier, on a night when a cabin burned and a door was found latched from the outside. That understanding was still coming. It arrived the way most terrible understandings do, slowly, and then all at once. The days that followed brought more paper, because that was how a man like Cornelius Vane preferred to wage his wars, not with guns or fists, which left marks and drew the attention of lawmen, but with documents, with liens and notices, and the polite, bloodless language of the law, wielded by people who understood that most homesteaders and trappers and small landholders in the territory had neither the money nor the education to fight paper with anything but fear. A second letter arrived within the week, this one more explicit, laying out a sum, $600, plus accumulated interest, that the bank claimed was owed against Elias's land, with a deadline of 60 days before the bank would be, regrettably, forced to pursue foreclosure. Elias took the letter to the territorial land office in the county seat, a full day's ride each way, and returned 3 days later with a look on his face that told Josephine, before he said a word, that the news was not good. The clerk showed me the recorded deed, he said, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 3 days fighting an institution designed to exhaust him. There's a note attached, all right. Filed 8 years ago. My father's signature on it, or something meant to pass for it. I asked the clerk who notarized it. He gave me a name I didn't recognize. A notary who used to work out of Cheyenne but moved on. Nobody seems to know where, sometime back. Convenient, Josephine said, and the word came out with an edge sharp enough to cut. Very. Elias rubbed his good hand over his face, the scarred side of his jaw catching the lamplight. I asked around town after, quietly. Hollis knew a thing or two once I got him talking. Says there've been at least 3 other families in the county lost land the same way these last 4 or 5 years. Liens on old debts nobody remembers taking, notarized by men who can't be found, foreclosed on by a bank that operates mostly out of a post office box. And nobody's connected it before now? Folks around here don't talk to folks in Nebraska, Josephine. Why would they? It's 300 miles and a whole territory line apart. Nobody's had reason to compare notes before. He looked up at her, and something grim and determined had settled into his expression. The look, she was coming to understand, of a man who did not anger loudly, but who, once angered, did not let go of a thing easily either. Until now. It was Hollis Prine, in the end, who supplied the piece that turned suspicion into something closer to certainty, though he did not know, when he mentioned it, the weight of what he was handing them. Funny thing, he said, leaning on the mercantile counter one afternoon while Josephine waited for an order of nails. Talking about that old notary fellow got me thinking backward. There was a land agent came through here, must be 11, 12 years back now. Smooth-talking sort, city suit, asking after parcels along the creek. Same year as the Hendricks fire, if I recall. That was the year your husband got his scar, if you didn't already know the story. Josephine went very still. What fire? Before your time, of course. Elias was a young man then, barely 23, boarding with the Hendricks family while he got his trapping business started. Fire took their cabin one night. Terrible thing. Whole family nearly lost, and Elias pulled the little girl out from under a falling beam, got burned something fierce doing it. Man they suspected of setting it, because there were always folks who suspected it was set, on account of the door being latched wrong somehow, was never caught. Vanished before anyone could ask him proper questions. Hollis shook his head, still absorbed in the nostalgia of an old story, rather than noticing the way Josephine's hand had gone rigid around the counter's edge. And here's the funny thing, now that I think on it properly. That land agent I mentioned, he was asking after the very same creekside parcels the Hendricks family owned. Never did buy anything, near as I recall. Just asked a powerful lot of questions and then moved on, right around the time of the fire. Mr. Prine, Josephine said carefully, do you recall a name? Hollis frowned, working at the memory the way a man works at a stubborn knot. Might have been Thane, might not. It was a long time ago, Mrs. Vane, and I confess I wasn't paying the kind of attention to a stranger's name that I might if I'd known it'd matter someday. She did not finish buying the nails. She walked home instead, 3 miles, the whole way turning over what she now suspected but could not yet prove. That the fire, which had scarred her husband 11 years ago, the fire that had killed the Hendricks family's hopes of ever fully recovering their footing, had not been an accident, and had not been unconnected to a land scheme that stretched, patient and unhurried, across more than a decade and at least 2 territories. That the same hand reaching for their land now had perhaps reached, once before, for a family's whole life, and had been willing to burn a house down with people sleeping inside it to get what it wanted. She told Elias everything that evening, watching his face carefully as she spoke, watching the old scar seem to tighten across his jaw as understanding dawned in him the way it had dawned in her. Slow, and then sickening, and then absolute. The door was latched from outside, he said, very quietly, staring at nothing. I always wondered. Everybody wondered. Nobody could ever prove a thing. We might be able to now, Josephine said, if we're careful.
If we find the right people to ask the right questions. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard in it before. Something old and long buried finally being lifted into the light. 11 years, he said. 11 years I told myself it was just a fire. Bad luck. A latch that jammed wrong in the heat, maybe. Though I never quite believed that part. Not really. Not down where it counts. If it was him, if it was Thane, or someone working for him, and he set that fire to clear land he wanted, and never got around to taking, because the family held on anyway out of stubbornness. He stopped, started again. Then he's been doing this a long time, Josephine. And he's not going to stop, because we ask him nicely. No, she agreed. He's not. So we won't ask nicely. The weeks that followed moved with the deliberate gathering pressure of a storm building on the horizon, visible a long way off, unstoppable once it arrived, and both of them working in the meantime to shore up whatever defenses they could before it broke. Elias rode to the county seat twice more, this time not merely to inspect the deed, but to file a formal challenge to the note's authenticity, a process the land office clerk,
a tired, overworked man named Abner Fitch, who had clearly seen more of these disputes than he had patience left for, warned him could take months and offered no guarantee of success. "Paper trumps memory in a court of law, Mr. Vane," Fitch told him, not unkindly. "If you can't produce a witness who saw your father sign or not sign that note, or a document proving where he was on the date it's dated, you're fighting shadows." "Then I'll find the light to see them by," Elias said, and Fitch, surprised by the flatness of the conviction in it, did not argue further. Josephine, meanwhile, wrote letters of her own to the county clerk's office in Nebraska, where her father's land dispute had been filed, requesting copies of every document related to the case, and to a lawyer in Cheyenne, whose name Hollis had produced after some digging, a man reputed to take on cases other lawyers considered too troublesome or too poor to be worth the fight. The lawyer's name was Franklin Boyd, a rumpled, sharp-eyed man in his 50s who arrived in Larkspur Hollow on the same stagecoach line that had once carried Josephine into town, and who listened to their story over 2 full hours at the kitchen table without once interrupting, taking notes in a small, cramped hand that reminded Josephine, uncomfortably, of the forged signature she had once been shown in a Nebraska office. "This is not the first time I have heard the name Thane," Boyd said finally, setting down his pencil. "There was a case 2 years back, out of Laramie County. Family lost their homestead to a similar note, similar circumstances. A debt nobody remembered taking, a notary nobody could locate afterward. The family didn't have the resources to fight it, and gave up the land rather than spend money they didn't have chasing a lawsuit they couldn't afford to lose." He looked between them, weighing something. "If what you're telling me is true, that this scheme reaches back 11 years and connects to an act of arson that may have been deliberately set to clear land, that is no longer merely a civil dispute over a debt. That is fraud, and quite possibly murder, or attempted murder, depending on how a court chooses to weigh the death of anyone in that fire." "Mrs. Hendricks died," Elias said quietly, 2 days after. "Her lungs never recovered from the smoke." Boyd's expression tightened. "Then it is very possibly murder indeed. But Mr. Vane, Mrs. Vane, I must be honest with you both, as I expect honesty is a quality you value above comfortable lies. Proving any of this will require more than suspicion and old memory. It will require documents. It will require a witness willing to speak against a man who has, by all appearances, made a career of ensuring witnesses either cannot be found or do not wish to be found. It will require patience, and it will require both of you being willing to stand in a public room and say these things aloud, to people who may not wish to believe you." Josephine and Elias looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that needed no words. The same steadiness that had carried each of them separately through years of being underestimated and dismissed now turned toward a single shared purpose. "We'll stand in the room," Josephine said. "We've both had plenty of practice being looked at. We can manage being heard, too." Boyd took the case, though he warned them it would take time, and time, they were about to learn, was a resource Cornelius Thane had no intention of allowing them. It was barely a week after Boyd's visit that the second front of the assault revealed itself. Not against the land this time, but against the business. Elias's freight contract, the one that supplied nearly half his income hauling goods between Larkspur Hollow and the rail spur, was abruptly and without warning canceled by the freight company's regional office, citing in a letter as smooth and bloodless as every other piece of paper that had touched their lives these past weeks, concerns regarding the contractor's financial stability in light of pending litigation against his property. "They're starving us out," Elias said, reading the letter a second time with his jaw set tight. "Can't take the land outright while there's a legal challenge filed against the note. So, instead,
They're choking off the money that had let us fight it. Man can't pay a lawyer with no income. Can they do that? Legally? They can do near anything they please, if they've got the right friends holding the right offices, Elias said grimly. And a man like Thane's had 11 years at least to make those kinds of friends. Josephine set her hand over his on the table, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both of them doing the same silent arithmetic. How long they could stretch what savings remained, how many months a fight like this might actually take, how much a man like Vane was willing to spend and wait and maneuver to make sure that in the end he did not lose. "We are not the first people he's done this to," she said finally. "And Mr. Boyd said there have been others too poor or too tired to fight. That means somewhere out there are people who already know things we don't, who might be willing to say them if somebody finally asked." Elias looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration moving behind his eyes, despite the grimness of the hour. "You're thinking we go find them?" "I'm thinking," Josephine said, "that a man who's gotten away with this for 11 years has gotten away with it because nobody's ever put all the pieces in the same room at the same time. We put them in the same room. All of them. Loud enough that nobody in this county can pretend not to have heard." It took the better part of 6 weeks to gather what they needed. 6 weeks that felt at times like walking through a landscape that kept shifting underfoot. A promising lead that dried up, a witness who agreed to speak and then, days later, sent word through a nervous neighbor that they'd changed their mind. A set of county records in Nebraska that arrived water-damaged and half illegible after a delay Josephine suspected, though could never prove, was not entirely accidental. But slowly, brick by brick, the way trust itself had been built between them months earlier through nothing but careful letters and patient honesty, a case began to take shape. Franklin Boyd tracked down a former clerk from the Cheyenne office where the missing notary had once worked. A nervous, aging man named Silas Pruitt, who had left the profession under circumstances he was initially reluctant to discuss, and who, after considerable and gentle persuasion and an assurance that Boyd would seek no retribution against him for what he'd once been party to, admitted in a signed and witnessed statement that he had on several occasions in years past notarized documents he had strong reason to believe were forged, at the instruction of a well-dressed gentleman who paid generously and asked no questions be asked of him in return. He could not with certainty identify Cornelius Thane by name from a description alone, but he did recall with unsettling clarity a detail Josephine had not expected: a scar, faint but visible, along the inside of the gentleman's left wrist. The kind a man gets, Pruitt speculated, from a fire that catches faster than expected when accelerant is poured too close to where a man is standing. Elias went very still when Boyd relayed this detail. "The Hendricks barn caught first," he said slowly, memory surfacing after 11 years of being pushed down. "Before the house. I remember there was a man running from the direction of the barn right before the house went up. I never told anyone that. I was 23 and half out of my mind with the smoke, and I never thought it mattered until just now." "It matters now," Boyd said quietly. Meanwhile, in Nebraska, Josephine's letters to the county clerk finally produced something concrete. A comparison of the supposedly forged note against 3 other notes filed against 3 other properties across 2 counties in the same period, all bearing signatures that, when set side by a clerk sympathetic enough to spend an afternoon on the comparison, showed the unmistakable hallmarks of a single hand, imitating several different men's signatures with varying but imperfect success. "It's not proof enough to hang a man," Boyd cautioned, laying the documents out across the Vane's kitchen table one evening in early July, the lamp burning late into the night. But it is proof enough to raise very serious, very public questions, and men like Thane do not survive public questions well. Their whole business depends on quiet, on courtesy, on nobody looking too closely or too loudly. We take this to a public forum. We make him answer in front of people who can no longer pretend not to have heard. "The county's holding a land grievance hearing next month," Elias said. "Open to the public, on account of there being enough disputes filed this year that the territorial judge is coming through to hear several at once. Ours is on the list already, on account of my challenge to the note." Boyd's eyes sharpened. "Then that is where we do this, in front of the judge, and in front of whoever in this county cares enough to come watch." The weeks leading up to the hearing were not calm ones. A note arrived at the cabin one night, unsigned, slipped under the door sometime after dark, warning in blunt and ugly language that certain persons who continued digging into matters that did not concern them might find themselves facing further, unspecified misfortune. Josephine read it twice, her jaw tight, and then set it on the table without visible fear, though Elias saw her hand tremble, just slightly, before she stilled it. "He's frightened," she said. "Men like that don't send threats when they feel safe."
They send them when the grounds started moving under their feet.
"Doesn't make the threat less real," Elias said. And that night, he checked every window latch in the cabin twice, and kept his rifle within reach of the bed for the first time since she'd moved in. Though he said nothing about it, only did it, the way a man protects what matters most, without needing to announce the protecting. They were not wrong to be careful. 3 nights before the hearing, Franklin Boyd's rented room above the boarding house was broken into while he was out to supper, his satchel of documents rifled through, though through what Boyd himself called either luck or foresight, having grown wary enough of Thane's methods over the preceding weeks to keep copies of everything scattered across 3 separate locations. Nothing irreplaceable was taken. "He knows what we've got," Boyd said grimly, surveying his ransacked room. "Which means he's going to come to that hearing ready to fight dirty. Be prepared for that." The hearing was held in the largest room Larkspur Hollow possessed, the same clapboard church where Elias and Josephine had married 3 months before, its pews now filled not with well-wishers, but with half the county, drawn by rumor and curiosity in equal measure. Because word had spread, the way word always spread in a territory starved for entertainment and hungry for scandal, that something significant was about to happen, though few understood exactly what. Cornelius Thane arrived precisely on time, in a gray suit as immaculate as the one Josephine remembered from Nebraska, flanked by a second lawyer he'd brought in from Cheyenne, moving through the gathered crowd with the same smooth, unhurried courtesy that at once made bad news sound like a kindness he was doing her. He nodded to Josephine as he passed, an acknowledgement so calm and so unbothered that for one cold moment her resolve wavered, some old instinct whispering that a man this composed could not possibly be beaten. Elias's hand found hers beneath the table where they sat, and squeezed once, and the wavering steadied. The territorial judge, a heavy-set, weathered man named Judge Aldous Rayner, who had ridden circuit through half of Wyoming territory for the better part of 2 decades, and had, by long practice, developed very little patience for courtroom theater of any kind, called the hearing to order and worked through 2 smaller grievances first, a fence line dispute, a disagreement over water rights, with brisk efficiency, before finally calling the matter of Vane versus the Territorial Trust and Loan Company. Cornelius Thane rose first, and spoke, as he always spoke, in a voice pitched perfectly between reasonable and regretful. "Your Honor, This is a simple matter of an unpaid debt, long overdue, which the defendant now wishes to contest based on nothing more substantial than his own incredulity that his late father might have taken a loan he chose not to disclose to his son. We have the note. We have held the note in good faith for 8 years. I understand this is difficult for the family to accept, but difficulty is not evidence. Franklin Boyd rose next, unhurried, and set on the table before the judge the full weight of 6 weeks' careful gathering. The comparison of forged signatures across 3 counties, the sworn statement of the former notary Silas Pruitt, the freight contract cancellation that arrived suspiciously timed to choke off the funds needed to mount a legal defense, and finally, the detail that made the room go utterly silent. Your Honor, I would like to call a witness, Mr.
Elias Vane himself, who, I believe, has testimony relevant not only to this land dispute, but to a fire that occurred in this county 11 years ago, in which a woman lost her life, and a man, this man, seated before you, was severely burned. A murmur went through the crowded pews, the specific murmur of a town remembering, all at once, a tragedy it had filed away as settled and unexplainable. Elias stood. For 11 years, he had turned the scarred side of his face away from crowds, out of habit worn so deep it had become instinct. He did not turn away now. He stood fully facing the room, facing the judge, facing Cornelius Thane's carefully composed expression, and let every eye in that church see the mark he carried plainly, without apology, for the first time in his adult life. 11 years ago, the Hendricks family took me in as a boarder while I got my trapping business started, he said, his voice steady, though the room had gone very still around him. Their barn caught fire first. I remember that clear now, though I didn't understand its importance until recently. The barn went up before the house did, which isn't how an accidental fire in a sleeping household usually spreads. And I remember a man running from the direction of that barn moments before the house caught. I was 23. I was half out of my mind with smoke by the time I got the little girl out from under a falling beam. And I never thought hard enough about that running man again, not until a witness described to my lawyer a scar along the inside of a certain gentleman's left wrist, the kind of scar a man gets from fire that catches faster than he expects. Every eye in the church turned, as one, toward Cornelius Thane. Thane's composure did not break, not entirely, not yet. He had built a career on never breaking in front of a room, but something tightened at the corner of his mouth, something that had not been there a moment before. This is speculation, Your Honor, wild speculation dressed up as testimony. My client has no scar on his wrist, and even if he did, a scar proves nothing. Then you won't object, Boyd said mildly, to showing the court your wrist, Mr. Thane, so that we might settle the matter plainly and move on. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Thane did not move, did not roll back his sleeve, stood instead very still, his smooth composure now visibly costing him effort to maintain, and Judge Rayner, who had sat through 2 decades of circuit hearings and had developed in that time an unerring instinct for the exact moment a man's silence became more damning than any confession, leaned forward in his seat. Mr. Thane, the court has asked you a simple question. I'd advise you answer it, one way or the other, before I start drawing my own conclusions from your reluctance. Slowly, with the particular stiffness of a man performing an action he very much does not wish to perform,
Cornelius Vane rolled back his left cuff. The scar was there, pale, old, faded to silver-white against his skin, running in a thin, ropey line along the inside of his wrist, exactly as Silas Pruitt had described it, exactly as a man might carry for 11 years after standing too close to flame he had lit himself. The church erupted into noise, not the ordinary noise of a restless crowd, but something sharper, angrier, a whole room's collective disbelief curdling, in the space of a few seconds, into fury. Judge Rayner banged his gavel twice, and it took a third strike before the room settled enough for him to be heard.
"Mr. Vane," the judge said, his voice gone hard as flint, "you will remain in this room, and you will answer every question put to you today, because what began as a land dispute has become, in the last 5 minutes, a matter I intend to refer directly to the Territorial Marshal's office, along with every document Mr. Boyd has seen fit to bring before this court." Thane's composure finally, fully cracked, and what emerged from beneath it was neither smooth nor courteous, a thin, cornered anger, the voice of a man who had spent so long controlling every room he entered that he had forgotten how to survive one he could not control. "You have no proof I set that fire. A scar is not a confession." "No," Boyd agreed calmly. "But a signed statement from your own former notary, describing your instructions to forge documents across 2 territories, spanning a scheme that appears to have targeted no fewer than 5 families over the past 11 years. That, combined with a scar exactly where a witness described it, combined with a freight cancellation suspiciously timed to strip my clients of the resources to defend themselves, combined with an unsigned threatening letter delivered to their home last week, that, Mr. Vane, is rather a lot of proof for a man to explain away as coincidence." Josephine sat perfectly still through all of it, her hand still wrapped tight in Elias's beneath the table, watching 11 years of a smooth man's careful cruelty come apart in front of a room that had, until 5 minutes earlier, been prepared to believe whatever he told them. She found herself thinking, oddly, not of her own lost land in Nebraska, nor even of the fear she'd carried since the unsigned note appeared under their door, but of the Hendricks family. A mother dead of smoke that never left her lungs, a father who had, Hollis mentioned once in passing, moved his surviving family east not long after, and never spoken of Larkspur Hollow again. A little girl, now grown into a woman somewhere, who had been carried out of a burning house by a young man who took the mark of that night into his own skin, so she would not have to carry the whole of it alone. That was the thing about a fire, Josephine thought. It never really finished burning. It just went quiet and waited, sometimes for 11 years, for someone brave enough or stubborn enough or simply tired enough of injustice to walk back into the smoke and ask the questions everyone else had been too frightened to ask. The marshal's office moved with more speed than either Josephine or Elias expected, though Boyd, unsurprised, explained that a case with this much documentation, this many victims across this many counties, tended to move quickly once it finally moved at all. The slow part, he said, was always getting anyone to look closely enough in the first place. Cornelius Vane was taken into custody within the week, held first in the county jail in Larkspur Hollow, before being transferred to await trial in Cheyenne on charges that included fraud, forgery, and, pending further investigation into the Hendricks fire, arson resulting in death. 2 of his associates, including the regional freight officer who had canceled Elias's contract, were named as well, their own smaller complicities unraveling quickly once the larger scheme came apart, and each man scrambled to distance himself from the others. The land Josephine had lost in Nebraska could not, in the end, be simply returned to her.
The property had already been resold to a third party who had purchased it in good faith and had no knowledge of the fraud beneath the transaction. But the court did award her a settlement drawn from Thane's seized assets, enough to cover what she had lost and more besides. Delivered with an apology from a Nebraska judge that Josephine received with the same level calm she had once used to face down a lawyer's smooth condescension. "It doesn't give me my father's house back," she told Elias that evening, turning the settlement papers over in her hands at their kitchen table. "But I find I don't need it back, exactly. I have a home already. I built one here, letter by letter, before I ever set foot in this territory." The note against Elias's own land was voided entirely, the forged signature formally struck from the county record, and Abner Fitch, the tired land office clerk who had once warned Elias he was fighting shadows, sent word through Hollis that he'd never in 20 years of clerking seen a case break so thoroughly in a homesteader's favor, and that he intended, personally, to buy Elias a drink the next time their paths crossed in the county seat. Elias's freight contract was reinstated within the month, the regional office suddenly and urgently eager to demonstrate its good faith now that its former officer's dealings with Vane had become public knowledge. And business, if anything, improved. Curiosity about the whole affair having made Elias something of a minor local figure. People who had once averted their eyes from his scar now nodding to him in the street. Some even asking, awkwardly but sincerely, after his well-being and his wife's. Not everyone apologized outright. Pride is a stubborn thing in a small town, and admitting you'd once whispered unkindly about a woman built like a plow horse, or looked away too fast from a scarred man's face, required a humility not every person in Larkspur Hollow possessed in equal measure. But the whispers stopped, mostly, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Ordinary courtesy, extended without visible effort, the kind of acceptance that doesn't announce itself because it has finally stopped needing to. The woman from the mercantile, the one who had once remarked, well within earshot, that she didn't know what kind of man needed a wife built like a plow horse, appeared at the Vane cabin one afternoon in late August, uninvited and visibly uncomfortable, carrying a basket of preserves she thrust toward Josephine, almost before the door had finished opening. "I heard what happened," the woman said, not quite meeting Josephine's eyes. "With the lawyer. And I heard what you said to me back in the spring, about lifting twice what my husband can, and I've thought on it more than I care to admit since. I was unkind. I don't imagine an apology 4 months late is worth much, but it's the one I've got, and I'd rather give it than keep carrying the shame of not having." Josephine considered her for a long moment, and then took the basket, and something in her posture, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the willingness to let forgiveness begin, eased the tension in the doorway. "Preserves are good any month you bring them," she said. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I make it too strong, fair warning." The woman almost smiled. "I've heard that about you. I'd like to try it anyway." Not every ending needs to be tidy to still be an ending, Josephine thought later that evening, watching the woman's wagon pull away down the road, dust rising gold in the last of the daylight. Forgiveness, she had learned somewhere in the long, slow accumulation of that difficult year, was not really about deciding someone else deserved it. It was about being tired of carrying the weight of not giving it. She was tired of a great many things by then. Tired of being looked at instead of seen. Tired of proving her worth to rooms that had already decided, before she opened her mouth, what conclusions they intended to draw. She found, standing on her own porch in the gold evening light with her husband's hand finding hers the way it did now, without either of them thinking twice about the gesture, that she was no longer quite so tired of any of it as she had once been. The weight had not vanished, but she had stopped carrying all of it alone, and that, it turned out, made an enormous difference. Autumn came to Larkspur Hollow the way it always did,
slow at first, and then all at once. The cottonwoods along the creek turning gold in a matter of days, the mornings sharpening into a cold that made the coffee taste better, and the woodpile matter more. Elias and Josephine spent the season the way they had spent every season since her arrival, working, mostly, because a homestead and a freight business did not run themselves, regardless of how much drama had recently unfolded around them, but working together now in a way that had become, without either of them remarking on it, simply how their days were shaped. She split wood while he mended harness. He hauled water while she worked the garden's last hardy vegetables free of the frost-touched earth. In the evenings they sat by the fire, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they simply sat, comfortable in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with words to prove the closeness is real. Cora, the widow Anders' fearless daughter, visited often, declaring on one particularly crisp October afternoon that she had decided, upon further research and consideration, that Josephine was, in fact, the strongest person not merely in Larkspur Hollow or Wyoming Territory, but quite possibly in the entire United States, a claim she delivered with such total conviction that neither Josephine nor Elias had the heart to suggest she might be exaggerating. "I stand by my research," Cora said solemnly, when Elias raised an eyebrow at the scope of the claim, and Josephine laughed so hard she had to set down the axe she'd been using, the sound of it carrying clear across the yard and out toward the creek, warm and unguarded, and entirely her own. There was a particular evening in late October, the sky doing the thing it did best in that country, cycling slow through purple and deep orange, and a blue so dark it was nearly black at the edges, the whole wide horizon on fire with color, in a way that had nothing to do with destruction, and everything to do with simple, unremarkable beauty. When Josephine found Elias standing at the edge of their land, looking east toward Nebraska, toward everything both of them had lost and found again, in the space of one long, difficult year. "Thinking about the Hendricks girl," he said, before she asked. "The one I pulled out from under the beam. I got word last week. Hollis tracked down with a family settled after. She's grown now, married, got 2 children of her own. I never told her, all these years, that I thought about that night more than I let anyone know. Never told her I was glad, whatever the fire cost me, that she made it out." "You should write to her," Josephine said. "Tell her now."
There's no rule says a debt of gratitude has to be paid on anybody's schedule but your own. He was quiet for a while, watching the color deepen over the western hills, and then he said, in a voice that carried the particular rawness of a man setting down something heavy he had carried so long he'd nearly forgotten its weight, "I think I will." She came to stand beside him, tall enough that their shoulders nearly matched, and for a while neither of them spoke, the two of them simply standing together at the edge of the land they had fought to keep, watching a sky that neither the fire 11 years ago nor the fraud of the past year had managed to take from either of them. "Do you ever think," she said finally, "about how strange it is that we found each other because we were both willing to admit, in writing, to strangers, that we were tired of being too much for the rooms we stood in?" "I think about it every day," he said. "I think the thing nobody tells you, growing up in a place like this, is that the world spends a great deal of effort teaching people to make themselves smaller, quieter, less scarred, less tall, less anything that draws a second look. And I think the bravest thing either of us ever did wasn't standing in that church answering Thane's lies.
It was writing an honest sentence in a newspaper advertisement, and trusting somebody, somewhere, might actually want the whole of what we were, instead of some smaller, easier version. Josephine did not answer right away. She simply reached over and took his hand, the same steady grip she had offered him on the dusty street the day she stepped off the stagecoach, unflinching, unhurried, entirely without apology. And together they watched the last color drain slow from the sky, two figures standing small and unbothered against a landscape wide enough, finally, to hold the whole of both of them exactly as they were. Not looked at. Seen. And for the first time in either of their long, careful, guarded lives, that was enough.